There are secrets that families bury so deep, they believe the earth itself will keep them hidden forever. But in the Carolina Low Country, where the land remembers everything, every drop of blood, every whispered prayer, every child born in darkness, some truths refuse to stay buried. What you're about to hear is a story so disturbing, so carefully concealed, that it took more than a century for the pieces to finally emerge. This is the account of a discovery that shouldn't have been possible, of a life that officially never existed, and of a family's desperate attempt to hide the unhideable. If you're drawn to the darkest corners of American history, where the most disturbing truths hide in plain sight, then subscribe to this channel. Because the stories we uncover here are the ones that history tried to forget. The Chapman Plantation records, discovered in a Charleston archive in 1964, contained an inconsistency that puzzled historians for years. Among the meticulous ledgers documenting cotton yields, slave purchases, and household expenses, there appeared a recurring entry: supplies purchased for 23 slaves. Yet every other document, tax records, insurance papers, correspondence with cotton factors, listed only 22 enslaved people. For more than a decade, this discrepancy was dismissed as a clerical error, the kind of minor mistake that creeps into any long-running set of accounts, until someone noticed that the error appeared consistently, month after month, year after year, spanning more than 2 decades, and always in the same handwriting, that of Richard Chapman himself. The Chapman family had been Carolina planters for 3 generations by 1846. Richard Chapman, at 47, had inherited Sweetwater Plantation from his father in 1829, along with its 2,000 acres of prime cotton land and the 22 human beings who worked it. The land had been in his family since his grandfather cleared it from cypress swamp in 1783, building the first rough cabin that would eventually become the elegant main house with its wide piazza and Doric columns. Richard Chapman had been groomed for this role from childhood. His father, Edmund Chapman, had been a severe man who believed that running a plantation required an iron will and absolute control. He had taught his son the intricacies of cotton cultivation, the management of enslaved labor, the delicate social dance required to maintain position among the planter elite. Richard had learned his lessons well, perhaps too well. His wife, Margaret, had been chosen for him by his parents when he was 23, and she was 17, a union of 2 prominent families, arranged with the same careful calculation used to breed thoroughbred horses. Margaret Ashworth had come from a Charleston family with old money and older pretensions. Her father owned a townhouse on Meeting Street and 3 plantations in the Low Country. She brought a substantial dowry to the marriage, including 12 enslaved people who formed the core of the Sweetwater household staff. They had been married 23 years by 1846 and had produced 3 children who survived infancy: Eleanor, 18, Thomas, 15, and Grace, 12. 2 other children had been born and died before their first birthdays. This was common enough that it barely rated mention in Margaret's letters to her Charleston relatives. Infant mortality was simply a fact of life, a sorrow to be endured and then forgotten. By all accounts, the Chapmans were a respectable family. Richard Chapman attended St. Mark's Episcopal Church every Sunday, sat in the family pew in the 3rd row, served on the vestry, and contributed generously to the building fund. He was known throughout Beaufort District as a fair master, which in the language of the time meant he didn't whip his slaves to death and generally fed them enough to keep working. He sold families together when he could afford to, allowed the enslaved people to keep small garden plots, and only rarely used the lash for serious infractions. By the standards of the Antebellum South, this made him humane. Margaret Chapman ran her household with the cold efficiency of a general commanding troops. She rose at dawn, inspected the work of the house servants, supervised the preparation of meals, managed the smokehouse and dairy and vegetable garden with exacting precision. She was not cruel precisely, but she viewed the enslaved people around her as equipment to be maintained and utilized, but never truly seen as human beings with interior lives. She spoke to them in the same tone one might use with a particularly dim-witted dog, not unkind, but fundamentally dismissive. Their children were being raised in the same tradition. Eleanor, at 18, was already managing portions of the household and learning the skills she would need as the mistress of her own plantation someday. Thomas was being groomed to take over Sweetwater eventually, learning to ride, to shoot, to give orders with the casual authority expected of a planter's son. Grace, the youngest, was still in the schoolroom with her governess, learning French and watercolors and the elaborate rules of etiquette that governed plantation society. What the Chapman family didn't know, what no one could have known, was that their carefully maintained world was about to fracture in a way that would expose the rotting foundation upon which it had been built. The first sign that something was wrong came in late March of 1846, though it would be months before anyone understood its significance. A field hand named Samuel, one of the strongest workers on the plantation, began showing strange symptoms. Samuel was 32 years old, a man who could work from sunup to sundown in the brutal heat without flagging, who could pick 300 pounds of cotton in a day during harvest season. He had been born at Sweetwater, the son of a woman named Rose who had died of fever when Samuel was 10. He knew no other life, no other place. He was, in the plantation's accounting books, worth approximately $1,200. At first, the symptoms seemed like simple fatigue. Samuel moved more slowly through the rows, struggled with tasks that had previously been easy for him, needed to rest more often. Walter Briggs, the overseer, noticed and assumed Samuel was shirking. He gave him a warning, then a lashing when the slow work continued. But the punishment didn't help. Samuel wasn't being lazy. Something was genuinely wrong with him. Then came the tremors in his hands, so severe that he dropped his hoe twice in one morning. The difficulty speaking, his words slurring as if he were drunk, though everyone knew he had no access to alcohol. The moments when he would stop mid-task and stare into the distance as if seeing something no one else could perceive, his eyes glazed and empty. Once, he fell to his knees in the cotton field and began to shake so violently that 3 other slaves had to hold him down to keep him from hurting himself. Dr. Henry Sutton, the physician who attended to the Chapman slaves when their value as property justified the expense, was called to examine Samuel. Dr. Sutton was 56 years old, a graduate of the Medical College of South Carolina, and he had been practicing in Beaufort District for nearly 30 years. He had seen every tropical disease that afflicted the Low Country, every fever and ague and mysterious ailment that struck down slaves and planters alike. But Samuel's symptoms baffled him. He checked for fever. There was none. He examined Samuel's eyes, his tongue, his pulse. He asked detailed questions about Samuel's diet, his living conditions, his work routines. He consulted his well-worn copy of Douglason's Practice of Medicine, reading passages aloud to Richard Chapman as if the printed word might reveal something his clinical examination had missed. Finally, Dr. Sutton declared it nervous exhaustion brought on by overwork. He prescribed rest, which was impossible since Samuel was valuable property who needed to be working, and laudanum, which Richard Chapman refused to purchase. If every slave who was tired got opium, he told Dr. Sutton with barely concealed irritation, I'd have a plantation full of addicts and no cotton picked. The man will recover or he won't. Send him back to the quarters and let nature take its course. Samuel was sent back to the fields, though his work was now virtually useless. He stumbled through the rows, barely able to lift his hoe, sometimes standing frozen in place for minutes at a time, while the other slaves worked around him. Briggs wanted to have him whipped again, but even the overseer could see that punishment was pointless. Samuel's condition was beyond his control. 3 weeks later, a woman named Dinah developed the same symptoms. Dinah was 28, a house servant who worked in the laundry and helped with the kitchen. She had been purchased 8 years earlier from a neighboring plantation when her previous owner died, and she had proven to be a skilled and reliable worker. Margaret Chapman particularly valued her because she could do fine needlework and had helped make several of Eleanor's dresses. When Dinah's hands began to tremble so badly she couldn't hold a needle, Margaret was annoyed rather than concerned. When Dinah began having difficulty speaking, slurring her words, and sometimes falling silent mid-sentence as if she'd forgotten what she was saying, Margaret assumed she was being insolent. It wasn't until Dinah collapsed in the hallway, her entire body convulsing, that Margaret realized something serious was wrong. Then James, a young man barely 20 years old, developed the symptoms. James worked in the stables, caring for the Chapman family's horses. He was particularly good with the animals, had a gentle way with them that even the most temperamental thoroughbreds responded to. Richard Chapman had been planning to hire James out to neighboring plantations as a horse trainer, thinking he could earn additional income from the young man's skills. Those plans evaporated when James began showing the same tremors, the same confusion, the same disturbing, vacant stare. Then Clara, another house servant. Then Abraham, who worked in the carpentry shop. Then Esther, who helped in the kitchen. By mid-April, 6 slaves were affected to varying degrees, each exhibiting the same disturbing pattern: progressive weakness, tremors, periods of confusion, and that strange fixed stare that made even the other enslaved people uneasy. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Something was spreading through the slave quarters, some illness or contagion that Dr. Sutton's medical training couldn't identify or explain. And it was happening slowly enough that people didn't die. They just became progressively less functional, less human, more like walking ghosts of themselves. Dr. Sutton was called back to the plantation, this time with more urgency. Richard Chapman was losing valuable property, and beyond the financial concern, there was a growing fear that whatever was affecting the slaves might somehow spread to the white family. Disease didn't respect the color line, after all, no matter how much plantation society pretended otherwise. Dr. Sutton spent hours examining the affected slaves, asking questions about their food, their water, their sleeping quarters, their work assignments. He looked for commonalities, for some shared factor that might explain why these particular people were falling ill while others remained healthy. He consulted his medical texts, sent urgent letters to colleagues in Charleston and Savannah, describing the symptoms in detail, and finally admitted that he had no explanation for what he was witnessing. "It's as if," he told Richard Chapman during a tense meeting in the plantation office, "they're all being slowly poisoned. The symptoms are consistent with certain toxic exposures, arsenic perhaps, or some other heavy metal. But I can find no common source, no explanation for how they're all being exposed to the same toxin. They work in different areas, eat from different pots, drink from different water sources. There's no logical vector for poisoning." The word "poisoned" sent a chill through the plantation that had nothing to do with concern for the suffering slaves, and everything to do with the implications for the white family. Poisoning was a slave rebellion tactic that haunted every plantation owner in the South. There were stories, passed in hushed tones among the planter class, of trusted house servants slowly killing their masters with rat poison mixed into coffee, of field hands contaminating wells with deadly substances, of coordinated attacks where multiple whites were simultaneously poisoned. The fear was existential. If slaves were poisoning other slaves, it might be practice, preparation for a larger attack on the white family, or it might be an attempt to cause chaos and economic damage to make the plantation unmanageable. Either way, it represented a threat to the fundamental order of things. Richard Chapman's hand shook when he lifted his morning coffee after that conversation. He found himself watching the house servants with new suspicion, wondering which of them might be planning something terrible. He ordered the slave quarters searched top to bottom, looking for hidden stores of rat poison or suspicious substances. He had the food supplies inspected, the cooking pots examined, the well water tested by having dogs drink it first. Nothing was found. No hidden poison, no suspicious substances, no evidence of any coordinated rebellion. The slaves went about their work with the same sullen resignation they always showed, and if they knew anything about the spreading illness, they weren't talking. The poisoning, if that's what it was, continued in its slow, methodical way. More slaves fell ill. By early May, 10 people were affected. By late May, 14. None of them died, which was somehow more disturbing than if they had. Death, at least, was comprehensible, part of the natural order of plantation life. This lingering sickness, this gradual erosion of their strength and faculties, felt like something else entirely. It felt deliberate, calculated, malicious. The atmosphere at Sweetwater Plantation became oppressive. The White family moved through their days with increasing paranoia, checking their food before eating, avoiding anything prepared by slaves they didn't absolutely trust. Margaret Chapman dismissed 2 house servants on vague suspicions, sending them to work in the fields despite their years of loyal service. Eleanor stopped taking walks on the plantation grounds, afraid to be away from the main house. Thomas began carrying a pistol everywhere, even to church. The enslaved people, meanwhile, lived with their own terror. They knew that when white people got scared, bad things happened to black people. They had seen it before. Accusations flying, innocent people punished, the lash coming down on anyone who looked suspicious or couldn't account for their whereabouts. They kept their heads down, worked harder than ever to avoid drawing attention, and whispered prayers that whatever was happening would stop before someone decided a few hangings might solve the problem. But even as this plague of the body was afflicting the slave quarters, a different kind of investigation was taking place. One that would reveal a truth far more terrifying than any disease. It began with the overseer, a hard man named Walter Briggs, who had worked at Sweetwater for 12 years. Briggs was 41 years old, unmarried, dedicated entirely to his work. He lived in a small house at the edge of the plantation, ate his meals alone, and spent his days on horseback moving between the fields, checking on the slaves' progress, enforcing Richard Chapman's orders with mechanical efficiency. He was not a particularly cruel man by the standards of his profession. He didn't enjoy inflicting pain the way some overseers didn't take pleasure in the power he held over other human beings. But he also had no illusions about the nature of his work. Slaves were property, to be managed like livestock, and if they needed to be beaten to maintain discipline, then he would beat them. It was simply the job. Briggs was not given to imagination or sentiment, but he was observant in the way that men who control other men must be. He noticed things, the subtle hierarchies among the enslaved people, who deferred to whom, who had influence beyond their official position. He noticed when someone was planning to run, could read it in their body language days before they made the attempt. He noticed when discipline was breaking down, when the delicate balance of fear and resignation that kept the system functioning was starting to tip in the wrong direction. And what he began to notice in those early weeks of spring 1846 was that one of the slaves seemed unaffected by the spreading illness. More than that, this slave seemed to move through the quarters with a strange kind of authority, checking on the sick, speaking to them in low voices, and always watching the main house, watching Dr. Sutton when he visited, watching Briggs himself with an intensity that made the overseer deeply uncomfortable. The slave's name, according to the plantation records, was Lucas. He was listed as 21 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, purchased 3 years earlier from an estate sale in Savannah, Georgia. The bill of sale described him as healthy, strong, no vices, field hand. He worked in the cotton fields during the growing season, helped with general maintenance and repairs during the winter, and had never caused any trouble. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of slave every planter wanted: productive, obedient, unremarkable. But Briggs, with his overseer's instinct for detecting potential problems before they bloomed into open rebellion, felt something was off about Lucas. It was hard to articulate exactly what triggered his suspicion. Perhaps it was the way Lucas held himself, with a straightness in his spine that suggested pride rather than submission. Perhaps it was the way the other slaves seemed to defer to him despite his youth and his relative newcomer status. When Lucas spoke, even older slaves listened. Perhaps it was something in his eyes, an intelligence and awareness that seemed out of place in a field hand who had supposedly spent his entire life in bondage. Or perhaps it was something else, something Briggs didn't want to consciously acknowledge but couldn't entirely ignore. There was something about Lucas's face, a certain cast to his features, a particular shape to his nose and jaw that looked hauntingly familiar. Not familiar in the way that people sometimes resemble each other by chance, but familiar in a specific, uncomfortable way. In certain lights, from certain angles, Lucas looked like someone Briggs knew, someone he saw every week when he gave his reports to the master. Lucas looked like Richard Chapman, not obviously, not in a way that would be apparent to a casual observer. His skin was dark enough to clearly mark him as having African ancestry. His hair had the tight curl common among the enslaved population. His features were his own. But underneath those surface differences, there was something in the bone structure, in the set of his eyes, in the line of his jaw that echoed the Chapman family features. In the antebellum South, this was not an unusual observation. Plantation owners routinely raped the women they enslaved, producing children who bore their features and were nonetheless kept in bondage. These children were sometimes whispered about, sometimes acknowledged in backhanded ways, but never, ever officially recognized as family. They were property, like their mothers, and the white family simply pretended not to notice the family resemblance walking among their slaves. But Lucas was different. He hadn't been born at Sweetwater. According to the records, he had been purchased from an estate sale in Georgia 3 years ago, arriving at the plantation as a teenager with no connection to the Chapman family. There was no reason, no possible reason, for him to resemble Richard Chapman, unless the records were false. Briggs said nothing at first. A wise overseer learned when to see things and when to be blind. Noticing too much could be dangerous, especially when it concerned the master's private affairs. But his curiosity, or perhaps his instinct for self-preservation, his sense that knowledge was power and power meant security, drove him to do something he had never done before. One evening when he knew Richard Chapman was in Charleston on business, Briggs went to the plantation office. He told himself he was just doing routine paperwork, checking the accounts, making sure everything was in order. But what he really wanted was to examine the documents related to Lucas's purchase. He wanted to see if there was anything in those papers that might explain the uncomfortable resemblance he'd noticed, anything that might confirm or dismiss his suspicions. The office was in a small building separate from the main house, a single room with a desk, file cabinets, and shelves lined with ledgers documenting decades of plantation business. Richard Chapman kept meticulous records. Every bale of cotton sold, every slave purchased, every expense incurred was noted in his precise handwriting. The files were organized by year, with separate sections for different types of transactions. Briggs found the slave purchase records for 1843 and began paging through them. There were several acquisitions that year. Richard Chapman had bought a woman named Betty and her 2 children from a neighbor who was settling debts, had purchased a blacksmith from a Charleston auction, had acquired 3 field hands from various sources, and there, near the end of the 1843 section, was the bill of sale for Lucas. The document looked entirely legitimate at first glance. It was written on the proper legal paper, bore the seal of Chatham County, Georgia, and was signed by the executor of Henry Ravenel's estate. It described the sale of one male Negro named Lucas, approximately 18 years of age, sound in body and mind, no scars or marks, field hand, to Richard Chapman of Sweetwater Plantation, Beaufort District, South Carolina, for the sum of $850. Everything appeared to be in order, except for one small detail that made Briggs's stomach turn cold. The paper was too fresh. Briggs had handled hundreds of these documents over his years as an overseer. He knew what 3-year-old paper looked like, how it yellowed slightly with age, how the ink faded and took on a particular patina. This document looked newer than it should. Not dramatically newer, the difference was subtle, the kind of thing you might miss unless you were looking for it. But once Briggs noticed it, he couldn't unsee it. He examined the document more closely. The seal looked correct. The signatures looked legitimate. But the paper itself, the physical paper, didn't seem to be 3 years old. It looked like it had been created more recently, and then carefully filed among older documents to disguise its true age, which meant that either his assessment was wrong, and he didn't think it was, or this document was a forgery, created after the fact to provide a paper trail for a slave who had supposedly been purchased 3 years ago, but who might actually have been at Sweetwater much longer than that. But why would Richard Chapman forge documents about one of his own slaves? What possible reason could there be to falsify purchase records? Unless Lucas hadn't been purchased at all. Unless he had always been at Sweetwater, had been born there, and the documents were created to hide that fact. But why? What could be so important about one slave's origins that it required manufacturing a false paper trail? The answer, when it finally occurred to Briggs, made his blood run cold. If Lucas had been born at Sweetwater, and if he resembled Richard Chapman, then there was only one possible explanation. Lucas was Richard Chapman's son, the product of a sexual relationship, probably rape given the power dynamics involved, with one of the enslaved women. And for some reason, instead of simply acknowledging this the way most planters did with their mixed-race children, Richard Chapman had gone to elaborate lengths to hide Lucas's true origins. But why such extreme measures? Plenty of plantation owners had children with enslaved women. It was common knowledge, barely even scandalous anymore. Some planters even showed favoritism to these children, giving them easier work assignments or teaching them to read. The children weren't freed or acknowledged as family, but their existence wasn't hidden either. What could make Lucas's parentage so much worse than the standard plantation horror story that it required forged documents and careful deception? Briggs stood in the plantation office, holding the falsified bill of sale, and felt the weight of the knowledge settling on his shoulders. He knew something he shouldn't know. Something dangerous. Something that could get him killed if he wasn't careful about how he handled it. But he was also a practical man who understood that information was valuable. If he played this correctly, if he was smart and careful, this knowledge could secure his future. Richard Chapman would pay handsomely to keep this secret buried. An overseer with this kind of leverage could name his price, could guarantee his position for life, could maybe even get a share of the plantation's profits. All he had to do was approach the master carefully, make it clear he was looking for security rather than blackmail, and negotiate a deal that benefited both of them. Walter Briggs had no idea he was signing his own death warrant. The conversation between Walter Briggs and Richard Chapman took place on an April evening in the plantation office, with the account book spread between them like a map of territory neither man wanted to fully acknowledge. Briggs had requested the meeting, claiming he needed to discuss concerns about security on the plantation in light of the mysterious illness affecting the slaves. Richard Chapman, preoccupied with the spreading sickness and the economic damage it was causing, agreed without much thought. They met after dinner, when the evening cicadas were beginning their nightly chorus, and the last light was fading from the western sky. Briggs began carefully, obliquely, the way a man approaches a snake he's not sure is venomous. He talked about the strange pattern of the illness, how it seemed to be affecting certain slaves but not others. He mentioned his concerns about Lucas's behavior, how the young man seemed to be moving among the sick slaves with unusual freedom, how he seemed to have their trust, how he might be organizing something dangerous. Richard Chapman listened with half his attention, making non-committal sounds, clearly thinking about other things. Briggs could see he needed to be more direct, to say something that would make Chapman really hear him. "I've been watching Lucas quite closely," Briggs said, his tone casual but his words chosen with care. "And I've noticed something curious. He has a very distinctive face, doesn't he? The bone structure, the way he carries himself, very familiar somehow." Richard Chapman's attention sharpened instantly. His eyes, which had been drifting toward the ledgers on his desk, snapped to Briggs's face. For a moment, neither man spoke. The office was very quiet except for the sound of crickets outside and the distant voices of house servants finishing their evening work. "I'm not sure what you mean," Chapman said slowly, but his voice had lost its casual tone. He sounded careful now, guarded. "I'm sure it's nothing," Briggs continued, watching Chapman's face carefully. "Just one of those coincidences. Though I must say, when I was going through the purchase records the other day, just routine bookkeeping, you understand, I noticed something odd about Lucas's documentation. The paper quality seemed unusually fresh for a 3-year-old document, but I'm sure there's a perfectly reasonable explanation. The color drained from Richard Chapman's face. For a long moment he simply stared at Briggs, and the overseer could see his mind working, calculating, trying to determine how much Briggs knew and how dangerous he might be. Then Chapman's expression shifted. The fear and shock faded, replaced by something colder, more controlled. This was the face of a man who had made difficult decisions before, who understood that power sometimes required ruthlessness. "What is it you want, Briggs?" Chapman's voice was perfectly steady now, businesslike. Briggs felt a flutter of relief. Chapman was willing to negotiate. This was going exactly as planned. "I want security, Mr. Chapman. I've been a loyal overseer for 12 years. I've never caused you any problems, never spoken out of turn, never been anything but discreet about plantation business. I'd like that loyalty to be recognized." "In what specific terms?" "A substantial increase in my salary. Say double what I'm currently earning. A written guarantee of lifetime employment here at Sweetwater. And perhaps a small share in the plantation's cotton profits. Just 5% would be more than fair." The terms were ambitious, but not outrageous. Overseers sometimes negotiated profit-sharing arrangements, especially on larger plantations. What Briggs was asking for was expensive but not impossible, and it would secure his silence absolutely. He would have too much to lose by talking. Richard Chapman considered this for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. "Those terms are acceptable. I'll have the paperwork drawn up within the week. You'll have your guarantee in writing, properly notarized. Your salary increase will be retroactive to the 1st of this month." Briggs felt a surge of triumph. It had worked. He had leveraged his knowledge into financial security without pushing too hard, without making threats that might have backed Chapman into a corner. This was the best possible outcome. "I appreciate your understanding, Mr. Chapman. You have my absolute discretion. Whatever I may have noticed or thought I understood, it ends here. I'm a loyal employee, and that loyalty comes with silence." "I know it does," Chapman said quietly. There was something odd in his tone, something that didn't quite match the apparent agreement they'd just reached, but Briggs was too pleased with himself to pay attention. They shook hands. The deal was made. Briggs left the office feeling like he'd just secured his future, certain that he'd played the situation perfectly. He was dead 3 days later. The official story was an accident. Briggs had been inspecting the cotton gin early in the morning, before most of the slaves had begun their day's work. Somehow, and no one could quite explain how it had happened, his clothing had caught in the machinery. Perhaps a loose shirt tail. Perhaps he'd leaned too close while the gin was running. The mechanics of cotton gins were notoriously dangerous. Accidents happened, though usually to the slaves who operated them, rather than to overseers who knew better than to get too close. By the time someone heard his screams and shut down the machinery, Briggs was catastrophically injured. His right arm had been pulled into the gin rollers and crushed. He had severe trauma to his chest and abdomen, where he'd been pulled against the machine. He was still alive when they extracted him from the machinery, but barely, and bleeding profusely from multiple wounds. Dr. Sutton was summoned urgently, but by the time he arrived, Walter Briggs was dead. The doctor examined the body, declared the death accidental, and signed the necessary certificates. There would be no inquest. Accidents were common enough on plantations that authorities rarely bothered with investigations unless there was obvious evidence of foul play. Richard Chapman arranged for a proper funeral. He sent Briggs's body to be buried in the churchyard at St. Mark's, purchased a decent headstone, and sent $200 to Briggs's only surviving relative, a sister living in Richmond. In his letter to the sister, he praised Briggs as a faithful employee who had died in the service of the plantation, and expressed his deep regret at the tragic loss. To outward appearances, Richard Chapman was genuinely grief-stricken by the accident. He attended the funeral, paid for everything, spoke movingly about Briggs's loyal service. No one questioned his sincerity. Why would they? Losing a good overseer was a real problem for a plantation owner, a genuine economic setback. No one questioned the story, no one investigated too closely, no one wanted to believe that something darker might have happened. But the slaves knew. In the quarters, where truth was traded in whispers and survived in the spaces between what was said and what was understood, they knew that Walter Briggs had been killed. They didn't know the details. They didn't know about Lucas's true parentage, about the falsified documents, about the confrontation in the office. But they understood the basic arithmetic of plantation justice. Briggs had learned something he shouldn't have, and knowledge like that was fatal for a white man, just as surely as it was for a black one. They also understood something else, something more disturbing. If Richard Chapman was willing to kill an overseer to protect a secret, he would certainly be willing to kill slaves. Whatever Briggs had discovered, it was dangerous enough that Chapman had crossed a line white men rarely crossed, murdering another white man, which meant the danger wasn't over. It meant that anyone who got too close to that secret, anyone who asked too many questions or noticed too much, might be next. The quarters became even quieter after Briggs died. People kept their heads down, avoided drawing attention, and definitely didn't discuss the strange illness that continued to spread, or the young man named Lucas who moved among the sick like a ghost. And Lucas knew. He had been watching the overseer watch him. He had seen the change in Briggs's eyes, the shift from casual observation to focused attention to something that looked almost like recognition. And when Briggs died so conveniently, so suddenly, less than a week after those attentions had intensified, Lucas understood that his own existence was somehow at the center of whatever had happened. For the first time in his life, he began to question his own story. Lucas had memories of arriving at Sweetwater as a teenager, of the long journey from Georgia, of the estate sale where he'd been separated from his mother. At least, he thought he had those memories. But when he tried to examine them closely, tried to recall specific details, everything became strangely fuzzy and indistinct. He remembered his mother's voice, but not her face. He remembered the Georgia plantation where he'd supposedly lived, but couldn't picture specific buildings or recall the names of other slaves who should have been there. He had a memory of the auction where he'd been sold, but the details were vague. He couldn't remember what city it had been in, couldn't recall the auctioneer's face, couldn't even clearly remember the journey to South Carolina afterward. It was as if his past had been written for him, planted in his mind like a story someone had told him so many times that he'd started to believe it was his own memory. But the more he examined these supposed memories, the less substantial they became. And then there were the scars. Lucas had scars on his back from whippings, the kind of scars every slave accumulated over time as punishment for real or imagined infractions. But he couldn't actually remember receiving most of those whippings. He knew he must have been punished at some point. All slaves were punished. But the specific occasions, the specific reasons, the pain and fear that should have been seared into his memory were simply absent. It was profoundly disorienting, like discovering that the ground you thought was solid was actually just a thin crust over empty air. Lucas began paying more attention to the world around him, looking for clues about his own history. He listened more carefully when the older slaves talked about the past, trying to determine if any of them remembered him arriving 3 years ago. No one seemed to. They treated him like he'd always been there, but when he tried to pin down specific memories or conversations from his early days at Sweetwater, no one could quite recall them. He also began watching the main house more carefully, studying the white family that owned him, and he began to notice things that should have been meaningless, but somehow weren't. He noticed that Richard Chapman sometimes watched him with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite guilt, something more complicated that Lucas didn't have words for. He noticed that Margaret Chapman refused to go near the fields where he worked, would physically turn away if she happened to see him at a distance. He noticed that the Chapman children, Eleanor, Thomas, and Grace, had features that echoed his own. The same high cheekbones, the same set to their eyes, the same line of their jaws. He had always assumed these resemblances were coincidental, the kind of random similarity that sometimes occurs between unrelated people. But now, with Briggs dead and his own past dissolving into uncertainty, Lucas began to wonder if there might be another explanation. The thought that formed in his mind was almost too impossible to believe. But once it was there, he couldn't make it go away. What if he wasn't just any slave? What if there was a specific reason his past seemed manufactured, his memories seemed implanted, his presence seemed to make the White family uncomfortable? What if he was Richard Chapman's son? The idea was absurd, except that it explained everything. It explained why his purchase documents might be forged, to create a false history that covered up the truth of his birth. It explained why he looked like the Chapman children, because they were his half-siblings. It explained why Richard Chapman watched him with that complicated expression, and why Margaret Chapman couldn't stand the sight of him, because he was a living reminder of infidelity or rape or whatever had led to his conception. But if this was true, it meant his entire life was a lie. It meant he had been born at Sweetwater, born into what should have been privilege and wealth, but instead had been condemned to slavery by the circumstances of his birth. It meant his parents, his real parents, had chosen to enslave their own child rather than acknowledge him. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not just the physical brutality of slavery, which Lucas had always known, but the psychological cruelty of making him believe he was one thing when he was actually another, of raising him to think of himself as property when he was, by blood, as much a Chapman as Eleanor or Thomas or Grace. Lucas didn't know what to do with this realization. He had no proof, only suspicions and circumstantial evidence. He couldn't simply walk up to Richard Chapman and demand the truth. That would get him killed as surely as it had gotten Briggs killed. But he also couldn't pretend he didn't know, couldn't go back to his former ignorance now that he understood what he was looking at. And there was another complication. The illness spreading through the slave quarters hadn't touched him. 14 slaves were now affected by the mysterious symptoms, 14 people growing progressively weaker and more confused, and Lucas remained perfectly healthy. At first he'd thought this was simply luck, but now he began to wonder if there was a pattern to who got sick and who didn't. He began cataloging the affected slaves in his mind. Samuel, who had been at Sweetwater his entire life and would remember if Lucas had really arrived 3 years ago. Dinah, who had worked in the main house and might have overheard conversations she shouldn't have. James, Clara, Abraham, Esther. All of them people who had been at Sweetwater for many years, people who would know if Lucas's supposed arrival was real or manufactured. The slaves who remained healthy were mostly newer acquisitions, people who had been purchased within the last few years and wouldn't have any knowledge of plantation history from before their arrival. Lucas's blood ran cold as he understood what he was looking at. Someone was systematically poisoning the slaves who might remember the truth. Someone was trying to eliminate anyone who could contradict the official story of Lucas's origins. And there was really only one person who had both the motive and the means to do that: Margaret Chapman. The realization that Margaret Chapman was poisoning slaves to protect her husband's secret should have made Lucas afraid for his own life. But instead, it made him angry in a way he'd never allowed himself to be angry before. Slaves learned early not to show anger, not to let resentment show on their faces. Anger got you whipped or sold or killed. The key to survival was submission, was learning to swallow rage so completely that eventually you almost forgot it was there. Lucas had learned that lesson well, or he thought he had. But now, understanding what had been done to him, understanding that his entire existence had been a lie constructed to protect the people who should have been his family, Lucas felt something break open inside him. A fury so profound it was almost cleansing, burning away the careful submission he'd maintained his entire life. He couldn't openly rebel. That would get him killed. But he also couldn't do nothing. He couldn't let Margaret Chapman continue poisoning people just to hide the truth of his birth. He needed to act, but carefully, in a way that wouldn't immediately get him killed. What he needed was leverage. He needed something that would force Richard Chapman to acknowledge the truth, to stop the poisoning, to somehow make this right. But what leverage could a slave possibly have against his own master? The answer, when it came to him, was almost laughably simple. The truth itself was leverage, not just the truth of his parentage, which only mattered to the Chapman family, but the truth about the poisoning. If Lucas could prove that Margaret Chapman was deliberately making slaves sick, if he could document it in a way that couldn't be denied, then Richard Chapman would have to act. Because poisoning slaves wasn't just a moral crime, it was an economic one. And worse, it could bring legal and social consequences that would destroy the Chapman family's reputation. But Lucas couldn't prove the poisoning himself. He was enslaved, illiterate, with no access to the evidence he would need. What he needed was an ally, someone who could investigate, who could collect proof, who could force the situation into the open. He needed Dr. Henry Sutton. The doctor had already expressed concerns about poisoning. He had examined the sick slaves, noted the symptoms, suggested that toxic exposure might be involved. If Lucas could point Dr. Sutton in the right direction, give him a reason to look more closely at Margaret Chapman's activities, the doctor might discover the truth on his own. But approaching Dr. Sutton was dangerous. White doctors didn't take information from slaves seriously, and trying to accuse the plantation mistress would likely get Lucas punished rather than believed. He needed to be indirect, to plant seeds of suspicion without making direct accusations. Lucas began watching Margaret Chapman's routines carefully, noting when she worked in her private kitchen, what supplies she used, where she stored things. He noticed that she made special preserves and baked goods in that kitchen, items that were sometimes distributed to house servants as rewards or sent to the quarters as gifts. He noticed that these gifts always went to specific people, the people who later fell ill. He also noticed that Margaret Chapman ordered supplies from Charleston that she kept in her private kitchen rather than in the main plantation stores. Special flours, fine cornmeal, imported ingredients that she claimed were for family use, but that sometimes found their way into gifts for favored slaves. Armed with this information, Lucas made his move. The next time Dr. Sutton visited the plantation to check on the sick slaves, Lucas made sure to be working near the main house. When the doctor emerged from examining another patient, Lucas was nearby, carrying water buckets, apparently just going about his work. "Doctor," Lucas said quietly, keeping his eyes lowered in the submissive manner expected of slaves. "May I speak, sir?" "Doctor." Sutton looked at him with mild surprise. Slaves didn't usually initiate conversations with white people. "What is it?" "It's about the sickness, sir. I've been thinking about what you said about poison, and I remembered something that might help." Sutton's attention sharpened. "Go on." "All the people who got sick, sir, they all received gifts from the main house. Special cornmeal, or preserves, or baked goods from Mistress Chapman's kitchen. I don't think it means anything, sir, but you said you were looking for common factors." Lucas delivered this information in the most neutral tone possible, as if he were simply reporting an observation without understanding its implications. He didn't accuse anyone, didn't suggest deliberate poisoning, just provided a data point that Dr. Sutton could interpret however he chose. The doctor's face went through several transformations: surprise, consideration, and then a carefully neutral expression that told Lucas his suspicions had found fertile ground. "That's interesting. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." "Yes, sir." "Is there anything else, sir?" "No, go about your work." Lucas bowed and left, his heart pounding. He had done what he could. Now he had to wait and see if Dr. Sutton would follow the thread to its conclusion. What Dr. Sutton did next would determine whether Lucas's gambit succeeded or failed catastrophically. The doctor was not a stupid man, nor was he particularly naive about the realities of plantation life. He knew that plantation mistresses sometimes poisoned people, usually their husbands' enslaved mistresses, occasionally rebellious slaves, rarely but not never their own husbands. It was one of those open secrets of Southern society, the kind of thing everyone knew about, but nobody discussed openly. But systematic poisoning of multiple slaves was unusual enough to be shocking. If Margaret Chapman was really doing this, the question was why? What could possibly motivate her to poison valuable property, to cause economic damage to her own household, to risk the legal and social consequences if she were caught? Dr. Sutton began investigating, but carefully. He didn't want to make accusations that might prove false, and he definitely didn't want to offend the Chapman family if there was some innocent explanation. He started by examining the 6 slaves more carefully, asking detailed questions about what they'd eaten in the days before their symptoms appeared. A pattern emerged quickly. Every single affected slave had consumed something that came from Margaret Chapman's private kitchen, not from the main plantation kitchen where food for the house servants was prepared, but from the smaller kitchen attached to the main house where Margaret personally supervised certain preparations. Dr. Sutton requested samples of the food items that had been distributed. Margaret Chapman, not yet realizing she was under suspicion, provided them willingly. The doctor took samples of her special cornmeal, her preserves, her baked goods. He didn't tell her he was testing them for poison. He claimed he wanted to analyze them for nutritional content, to see if some deficiency might be contributing to the slave's illness. The tests were simple but conclusive. The cornmeal contained arsenic. Not a lot, just enough to cause gradual poisoning if consumed regularly. The preserves were clean, the baked goods were clean. But the cornmeal, which Margaret Chapman had been distributing to specific slaves as a supposedly generous gift, was contaminated. Dr. Sutton found himself in an impossible position. He had proof that Margaret Chapman was poisoning slaves, but revealing that proof would destroy the Chapman family's reputation and possibly his own career. Plantation families didn't like doctors who exposed their scandals. He could easily find himself blacklisted throughout the district, unable to practice medicine, ruined by the very discovery he'd made. But he was also bound by medical ethics and by law. Poisoning was illegal, even when the victims were enslaved. If he stayed silent and more slaves died or were permanently damaged, he would be complicit in a crime. Dr. Sutton made a decision. He would confront Richard Chapman privately, present the evidence, and let Chapman decide how to handle his wife. This way, the family scandal could be contained while still stopping the poisoning. It wasn't justice exactly, but it was the best compromise he could manage given the constraints of the society he lived in. The confrontation between Dr. Sutton and Richard Chapman took place in the plantation office on a May evening. The doctor brought his test results, his documentation of which slaves had been poisoned and when, and his evidence that the contaminated cornmeal came from Margaret Chapman's private stores. Richard Chapman listened to all of this with a face that might have been carved from stone. He didn't interrupt, didn't deny, didn't try to excuse or explain. He simply listened. As doctor, Sutton methodically laid out the case against his wife. When the doctor finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Chapman spoke. "What do you intend to do with this information, Dr. Sutton?" "That depends on you, Mr. Chapman. If the poisoning stops immediately, if you deal with the situation within your family, I'm willing to consider this a private medical matter. But if it continues, or if any of these slaves die, I'll be obligated to report my findings to the authorities." "I see." Chapman's fingers drummed on his desk, the only sign of agitation in his otherwise controlled demeanor. "I assume you've wondered why my wife would do something so apparently irrational. Poisoning valuable property, risking exposure, causing economic damage to her own household." The thought had occurred to me. "Did the slave who brought this to your attention, Lucas, I believe, did he offer any theories?" Dr. Sutton felt a chill run down his spine. The way Chapman said Lucas's name, the sudden focus on the one slave who had provided the crucial information, suggested dangerous currents beneath the surface. He merely pointed out a pattern. He didn't speculate about motivations. "No, I don't suppose he would. He's smarter than that." Chapman stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening plantation grounds. "Dr. Sutton, what I'm about to tell you goes no further than this room. If you speak of it to anyone, I will deny everything and ensure your medical practice in this district is finished. Do you understand?" "I understand. My wife has been trying to eliminate witnesses, people who might remember things that contradict the official story of Lucas's arrival at this plantation. Because Lucas didn't arrive 3 years ago from Georgia. He's been here his entire life. He was born at Sweetwater in 1824. Dr. Sutton's mind raced through the implications. If Lucas was born at Sweetwater in 1824, that meant he's your son. Yes. And you've kept him enslaved? What choice did I have? Chapman's voice carried a note of anguish that might have been genuine or might have been performance. The child was too dark to acknowledge. My wife had been unfaithful, or I believed she had been. If I'd freed him, questions would have been asked. Our reputation would have been destroyed. The only solution was to hide him among the slaves and create a paper trail that explained his presence without connecting him to our family. That's monstrous. That's practical. I've provided for him. He's been fed, clothed, given work appropriate to his abilities. He's alive, which is more than many people in his position can say. And the secret has been maintained for 22 years. It would have stayed maintained if my wife hadn't lost her nerve and started this insane campaign to eliminate potential witnesses. Dr. Sutton struggled to process what he was hearing. The casual way Chapman described enslaving his own child, as if it were a reasonable solution to a social problem, was almost incomprehensible. But this was the antebellum South, where human beings were property and reputation mattered more than humanity. By the standards of his time and place, Chapman was probably telling the truth when he claimed he'd been merciful by letting the boy live at all. "What do you intend to do now?" the doctor asked. "Stop the poisoning, obviously. My wife will be sent away. To a sanitarium, I think. Nervous exhaustion. She'll be comfortable there, and the situation will be contained. As for Lucas," Chapman trailed off, clearly thinking, "that's more complicated. You could free him, and have him tell this story to anyone who will listen. He's not stupid, Doctor. He's figured out who he is. I can see it in the way he looks at me now. If I free him and he starts talking, the entire truth comes out anyway. But if I keep him enslaved, knowing what he knows, he becomes dangerous in a different way. A slave with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous kind. So what's your solution?" "I don't know yet, but I'll think of something. In the meantime, I need your silence, Doctor. Complete silence about all of this. The poisoning, Lucas's parentage, everything. In exchange, I'll ensure the poisoning stops immediately. I'll compensate you handsomely for your discretion, and I'll make sure no harm comes to any of the slaves who were affected. They'll recover, and this incident will be forgotten." Dr. Sutton knew he was being bought. He also knew he didn't have much choice. Speaking out would destroy him professionally and probably wouldn't actually help the enslaved people at Sweetwater. The best he could do was ensure the immediate danger stopped and hope that Chapman's solution for Lucas didn't involve simply killing the young man and disposing of the body. "I want your word that Lucas won't be harmed." Chapman considered this. "You have it. Whatever I decide to do about him, I won't have him killed. He is, after all, my son." It was a terrible bargain, but it was the best Dr. Sutton could negotiate. He agreed, took Chapman's money, and left the plantation carrying knowledge that would weigh on him for the rest of his life. What happened next unfolded with surprising speed. Within 3 days, Margaret Chapman was removed from Sweetwater Plantation and transported to a private sanitarium near Columbia. The official story was that she had suffered a nervous breakdown brought on by the stress of managing the household during the slave illness. She had stopped eating, stopped speaking, and needed specialized medical care that couldn't be provided at home. The story was believable because it was partially true. Margaret Chapman had been under tremendous stress, and by the time she was taken away, she genuinely had stopped speaking and eating. Whether this was genuine psychological collapse or a calculated performance to avoid facing consequences for the poisoning, no one could say for certain. The slaves who had been poisoned began to recover slowly. With no new exposure to arsenic, their bodies gradually cleared the toxin. The tremors faded, the confusion lifted, and within a few weeks most of them were able to return to work. A few never fully recovered their strength, but they survived, which was more than anyone had expected during the worst of the crisis. And Lucas received a summons to the main house. He had never been inside the main house before. Slaves entered only as servants, and field hands like him had no reason to cross that threshold. But the house servant who delivered the message was clear. Mr. Chapman wanted to see him alone in the study. Lucas approached the main house with a mixture of fear and strange exhilaration. Whatever was about to happen would be decisive. Either Richard Chapman had decided to kill him quietly, or something else was in motion, something that might actually change his circumstances. He was ushered into the study, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive desk. Richard Chapman sat behind that desk, looking older than Lucas remembered, the weight of recent events showing in the lines of his face. "Close the door," Chapman said quietly. Lucas obeyed, then stood in the awkward silence that followed, not sure if he should speak or wait. "You know, don't you?" Chapman finally said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "How long have you known?" "I started to suspect after the overseer died. I became more certain after I realized the pattern to who was getting sick." Chapman nodded slowly. "You're intelligent. That's caused problems, but it's also impressive. If circumstances were different, if you'd been born with lighter skin, you would have been educated, given opportunities. You might have become something significant." Lucas felt anger flare, but kept his voice neutral. "Instead, I was made a slave. Yes, and I won't apologize for that, because apologies are meaningless. I did what I thought I had to do to protect my family. Your existence threatened everything we'd built, everything we were. I made a choice, and I've lived with it. And now things have changed. My wife's actions have made the situation untenable. Too many people suspect too much. Dr. Sutton knows the truth. You know the truth. It's only a matter of time before others start asking questions. I need to find a solution that protects both of us." Lucas waited, hardly daring to hope. "I'm going to free you," Chapman said quietly. "But there are conditions. You'll leave South Carolina immediately. You'll go north, Philadelphia probably, where there's an established free black community. I'll provide you with papers of manumission, a letter of introduction to contacts there, and enough money to establish yourself. In exchange, you'll never speak of your connection to this family. Never claim the Chapman name, never tell anyone what happened here, never come back to South Carolina. And if I refuse, then we're both in trouble, because I can't keep you here knowing what you know, and I can't kill you without inviting exactly the kind of investigation I'm trying to avoid. Your only leverage is the truth, and my only leverage is your desire to be free. We can either help each other, or we can destroy each other. I'm offering you the first option." Lucas considered this. Freedom, but freedom purchased with silence. A life in Philadelphia, but a life built on denying his own history, his own identity. It was another kind of prison, perhaps, but it was infinitely better than the one he was currently in. What about the others? The slaves who were poisoned, will they be punished? No, they've suffered enough, and punishing them would only draw more attention. They'll be left alone. And your wife? Will spend the rest of her life in the sanitarium. She won't be coming back. Lucas thought about the woman who had tried to poison him and so many others, who had been willing to kill to protect a secret that wasn't even hers. He felt no sympathy for her, but he also felt no triumph. Her fate was just another piece of the tragedy that had unfolded from one act of infidelity or rape or whatever had led to his conception 22 years ago. "I accept your offer," Lucas said finally, "but I have one condition of my own." Chapman raised an eyebrow. "You're not in a position to negotiate. Neither are you. My condition is this: I want to be baptized before I leave, with your name. I want it recorded in a church register that Lucas Chapman exists, that he was baptized, that he is a person with an identity. You can deny me everything else, but you can't deny me that." It was a small thing, perhaps, but it mattered to Lucas. It meant that somewhere, in some official record, his true identity would be preserved. Even if he never spoke of it, even if he lived the rest of his life under a different name or simply as Lucas, there would be proof that he had existed, that he had been Chapman's son, that he was more than just a piece of property that appeared and disappeared from the records without explanation. Chapman considered this for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he agreed. "Very well. I'll arrange it. We'll go to Charleston, have you baptized at St. Philip's. The priest won't ask questions if I compensate him adequately." And so it was decided. Lucas Chapman's fate was negotiated in that study, his freedom purchased with his silence, his identity preserved in one small church record that might never be read by anyone who mattered. The journey to Charleston took 2 days. Richard Chapman and Lucas traveled together, master and slave in public, father and son in the privacy of their shared silence. They didn't speak much during the journey. What was there to say? Everything that mattered had already been said, and small talk seemed absurd given the circumstances. They stayed at the Charleston Hotel, with Lucas sleeping in the servants' quarters and Richard Chapman in a proper room upstairs. The baptism took place at St. Philip's Church on a May morning. The priest, Reverend Thornton, performed the ceremony with a carefully blank expression that suggested he understood something unusual was happening, but knew better than to ask questions. Lucas knelt at the baptismal font, felt the water touch his head, heard his name, his true name, spoken aloud for the first time in his life. "I baptize you, Lucas Chapman, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." The priest signed the register. Lucas Chapman, adult baptism, parents unknown. That last part was a lie, of course, but it was the kind of lie that protected everyone involved. The important thing was the name. Lucas Chapman. Officially recorded, officially recognized, proof that he existed. After the baptism, Richard Chapman took Lucas to meet with an attorney named Josiah Crawford. Papers of manumission were prepared, notarized, and placed in a sealed envelope that Lucas would carry with him. The papers described him as Lucas, a male of color, approximately 21 years of age, freed by Richard Chapman of Sweetwater Plantation in recognition of faithful service. It was all lies, but it was the right kind of lies. The kind that would allow Lucas to live as a free man in the North. Chapman also provided him with $200, a substantial sum that would support him for months if he was careful. And he provided a letter of introduction to a Methodist minister in Philadelphia, a man named Reverend Thompson, who helped freed slaves establish themselves in the city. "The letter doesn't mention our connection," Chapman explained. "It simply says you're a freed slave of good character who deserves assistance. Reverend Thompson will help you find work and housing. Beyond that, you're on your own." "I understand." They stood outside the attorney's office, preparing to part ways forever. Chapman looked at Lucas with that same complicated expression he'd worn so many times before. Guilt, regret, relief, and something that might almost have been affection. "I'm sorry," Chapman said quietly. "Not sorry enough to have done things differently, perhaps, but sorry nonetheless. You deserved better than what you got." Lucas could have said many things in response. He could have raged about the 22 years stolen from him, about being raised in bondage when he should have been raised in privilege, about the profound cruelty of enslaving your own child. But what would be the point? Nothing he said would change what had happened, and anger wouldn't help him build the new life that was now opening before him. "Goodbye, Mr. Chapman," Lucas said, deliberately using the formal address rather than acknowledging any familial connection. "Goodbye, Lucas." They shook hands, a strange gesture between a former master and his formerly enslaved son. And then Lucas turned and walked away. He didn't look back. There was nothing behind him worth seeing. Everything that mattered lay ahead. Lucas Chapman arrived in Philadelphia in September 1846, carrying his manumission papers, his letter of introduction, and $200 that represented everything he owned in the world. The city was overwhelming at first. Lucas had never seen so many buildings, so many people, so much movement and noise and life compressed into such a small space. Philadelphia had nearly 400,000 residents by 1846, making it one of the largest cities in America. And unlike the South, where black people were either enslaved or living in precarious quasi-freedom, Philadelphia had a substantial free black community. More than 20,000 people of color who had built churches, businesses, schools, and social networks. Reverend Thompson, the Methodist minister Richard Chapman had written to, turned out to be a kind man in his 50s who asked no uncomfortable questions about Lucas's past. He helped Lucas find lodging in a boarding house for black men in the Moyamensing district, introduced him to people who might provide work, and invited him to attend services at Mother Bethel AME Church. Lucas found work as a carpenter's apprentice. He had basic woodworking skills from his time at Sweetwater, and he learned quickly. The carpenter, a free black man named James Fortin Jr., paid him fairly and taught him the finer points of the trade. Within a year, Lucas was skilled enough to work independently. He also learned to read and write, attending night classes offered by the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. This was revolutionary for him, not just acquiring the skills themselves, but understanding what it meant to be able to access knowledge directly, without mediation by white people who controlled what information slaves received. In 1849, Lucas married a woman named Rachel Dorsey. Rachel had been born free in Philadelphia, the daughter of a barber and a seamstress. She was intelligent, devout, and practical, with a deep commitment to helping newly freed slaves adjust to life in the North. She taught Lucas how to navigate the complex social world of free black Philadelphia, how to avoid the constant dangers posed by slave catchers and racist violence, how to build a life that was genuinely his own. They had 4 children together: William, born in 1850, Sarah, born in 1852, James, born in 1854, and Catherine, born in 1857. Lucas raised them to be proud, educated, and free, everything he hadn't been allowed to be. He told them nothing about his own past, only that he had been enslaved in South Carolina and had gained his freedom before coming north. They knew nothing about the Chapman family, nothing about their grandfather, who had kept their father in bondage, nothing about the white half-siblings who existed somewhere in the South. Lucas kept his promise. He never spoke publicly about his connection to the Chapman family. He never tried to claim any inheritance or recognition. He lived as simply Lucas Chapman, a free black carpenter, a member of the Methodist Church, a husband and father who had overcome slavery to build a good life. But he never forgot, and near the end of his life, when he was 65 years old and weakening from age and illness, he finally wrote down the truth. He wrote a letter to his children explaining who he really was, where he really came from, and what had been done to him. He sealed that letter with instructions that it wasn't to be opened until after his death, that they should read it together, and then decide what to do with the information. In that letter, written in 1887, Lucas Chapman finally told his story. He described his childhood at Sweetwater, the dawning awareness that something about his situation was wrong, the terrible revelation of his true parentage. He wrote about the poisoning, about Briggs's death, about the confrontation with Richard Chapman and the negotiation that led to his freedom. He explained why he had kept silent for 40 years and why he was finally breaking that silence. And he wrote the passage that would later become famous among historians who studied his case. I have sometimes wondered what my life would have been if I had been born with the right color skin, if I had been raised in the main house instead of the quarters, if I had been acknowledged as the first Chapman son. But then I think of what that would have required, accepting the system that made such distinctions matter, participating in the enslavement of others, becoming the kind of man my father was. And I realize that being cast out, being raised among those who suffered, taught me more about human dignity than any privileged upbringing could have. My slavery, as terrible as it was, made me free in ways that my white siblings never could be. They remained trapped in the prison of their own supremacy, while I escaped into the larger world where a man's worth has nothing to do with the color of his skin or the circumstances of his birth. Lucas Chapman died in January 1889, surrounded by his wife and children. His obituary in the Christian Recorder described him as a man of quiet dignity and firm faith, who had overcome the cruelties of slavery to build a life of purpose and integrity. There was no mention of the Chapman family, no hint of the secret he had carried for his entire life. His children opened the letter after the funeral and read their father's story with shock and grief and anger. They debated what to do with the information, whether to make it public, whether to seek some kind of acknowledgement from the Chapman family, whether to simply preserve it privately as part of their family history. They decided on the latter. The Chapman family no longer mattered to them, and exposing the story publicly would only invite painful attention. So they kept the letter, passing it down through generations, a private testament to one man's impossible life. It stayed private until 1964, when the plantation records were discovered with their telling discrepancies, and historians began asking questions that Lucas Chapman's descendants could finally answer. Back at Sweetwater Plantation, life continued in its appointed rhythms, though the household never fully recovered from the events of 1846. Margaret Chapman lived for 7 more years in the sanitarium, never speaking, never writing, never acknowledging visitors. The staff there treated her humanely, but she remained locked in her own silence until her death in 1853. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but one of the nurses later said she believed Margaret simply gave up, that she had decided death was preferable to living with what she'd done. Richard Chapman lived another 15 years, dying in 1861 just as South Carolina was seceding from the Union and the Civil War was beginning. He never remarried, never spoke of his first wife, never acknowledged that he'd had a son beyond his 3 legitimate children. His obituary in the Charleston Mercury praised him as a fine example of Carolina manhood, a planter of the old school, a man of honor and principle who served his community with distinction. The irony of that description, given what historians now know, is almost unbearable. Eleanor Chapman married a neighboring planter in 1848 and moved to Georgia, where she died in childbirth in 1851 at the age of 23. Thomas Chapman inherited Sweetwater Plantation and managed it until 1865, when advancing Union troops burned most of the buildings and freed the remaining slaves. He spent the rest of his life trying to resurrect the plantation economy, failing repeatedly and drinking heavily to cope with the loss of the only world he'd ever known. He died in 1882, broke and bitter. Grace Chapman, the youngest, married a Charleston merchant and lived into the early 20th century. She was the last person who would have remembered 1846, the last person who might have been able to confirm or deny the truth about Lucas. But if she knew anything, she never spoke of it. She died in 1923, taking whatever knowledge she had to her grave. Dr. Henry Sutton, who knew far too much for anyone's safety, died suddenly of apoplexy in 1848, less than 2 years after the poisoning crisis. He was only 58 years old and had been in apparently good health before his sudden death. The convenient timing of his death has led some historians to wonder if natural causes were truly responsible, or if Richard Chapman had decided that even a paid-off witness was too dangerous to leave alive. There's no proof either way, but the suspicion remains. The slaves who had been poisoned lived out their lives in bondage until the Civil War freed them. Most of them remained in South Carolina after emancipation, taking the surname Freeman or Washington or other names that signified their new status. None of them ever spoke publicly about the poisoning or about Lucas, though their descendants later reported family stories about the year the mistress went mad and the young man who disappeared. And Sweetwater Plantation itself eventually passed out of Chapman family hands, sold to pay debts in the 1890s. It changed hands several times over the 20th century, fell into disrepair, and was finally purchased by a historical preservation society in the 1970s. It's now open to the public as an example of antebellum architecture and plantation life. Tourists walk through the carefully restored rooms, admire the period furniture, and listen to guides describe the daily life of a Carolina planter family. Sometimes they visit the restored slave quarters, where interpretive signs explain the living conditions of the enslaved people who worked the cotton fields. But there's nothing that explains Lucas. Nothing that tells visitors about the 23rd slave, the one who appears in the account books but nowhere else. Nothing about the child who was hidden in plain sight, whose entire existence was a secret that had to be maintained at any cost. Nothing about the son who became property, about the freedom that was purchased with silence, about the truth that stayed buried for more than a century. His story survived only because of chance, because someone in 1964 noticed a discrepancy in old ledgers and had the curiosity to investigate. Because certain documents were preserved when they should have been destroyed. Because Lucas himself, at the end of his life, chose to write down what had happened to him. Because his descendants kept that letter safe for 75 years, waiting for a time when the truth could finally be told without danger. If any one of those things had gone differently, if the records had been more carefully falsified, or if Lucas had died without writing his letter, or if his descendants had destroyed it rather than preserving it, the truth would have died completely. We would never know that there was a Chapman son who lived among the slaves, who was baptized in secret, who was freed to preserve a lie, and who ultimately found more humanity in bondage than his family ever found in freedom. The question that haunts historians who study this case is simple. How many other stories like this exist, still buried, still unknown? The Chapman case is remarkable not because it was unique, but because it was documented. The discrepancies in the plantation records, the falsified documents, the baptismal register, Lucas's letter, these pieces of evidence happened to survive and happened to be noticed by people who cared enough to investigate. But for every Lucas Chapman whose story somehow survived, how many others vanished completely? How many children were hidden among enslaved populations, their true parentage never recorded, never acknowledged, never documented in any way that would allow historians to discover them? How many secrets are still locked in archives, waiting for someone to notice an inconsistency, to pull at a thread, to uncover truths that were buried with meticulous care? The historical record suggests there were many. Researchers studying plantation documents have found numerous cases of unexplained discrepancies in slave counts, of individuals who appear in some records but not others, of children whose parentage is mysteriously unrecorded. Most of these cases can never be fully investigated because the evidence simply doesn't exist. The people involved made sure of that. What makes the Chapman case extraordinary is not what happened. The enslavement of a master's child, the systematic poisoning to hide the truth, the eventual freedom purchased with silence. All of that was probably more common than we like to think. What's extraordinary is that we know about it, that we can name the people involved, that we can trace the story from Lucas's birth in 1824 through his death in 1889 and beyond to his descendants living today. And yes, Lucas Chapman has living descendants, more than 100 of them spread across the United States, carrying his story in their family histories. Some of them are descended from William, his oldest son. Some from Sarah, from James, from Catherine. They're teachers and doctors and artists and mechanics, living ordinary American lives, carrying within them the legacy of a man who was born enslaved but died free, who was denied his birthright but built something better with his own hands. In 2003, some of Lucas Chapman's descendants attempted to contact the last living relatives of the Chapman family to share the story and perhaps seek some kind of acknowledgement or reconciliation. They were rebuffed. The Chapman descendants either didn't believe the story or didn't want to acknowledge it. The two branches of the family, divided by race and by history, remain divided today, which is perhaps fitting. Lucas Chapman spent his life trying to escape the shadow of the family that had enslaved him. His descendants have built their own identities, their own legacies, independent of the Chapman name and everything it represents. They don't need acknowledgement from white relatives who would probably never fully understand what Lucas endured or appreciate what he accomplished. The story matters not because of what it says about one family, but because of what it reveals about the system that made such stories possible. American slavery was built on the fiction that racial categories were natural and immutable, that white people and black people were fundamentally different kinds of human beings with different destinies and different rights. But Lucas Chapman's existence proved the lie at the heart of that system. He was Richard Chapman's son, genetically as much a Chapman as Eleanor or Thomas or Grace. But because of the randomness of which genes expressed themselves in his skin tone, because of his mother's unknown identity, because of the rigid rules about race and legitimacy that governed antebellum society. He was cast into slavery while his half-siblings lived in luxury. The boundary between free and enslaved, between human and property, between child and commodity, it was never about inherent differences at all. It was only about power, and what those who held it were willing to do to maintain their position. And when that boundary was threatened, when a child was born who revealed the arbitrariness of the entire system, the response wasn't to question the system, but to hide the evidence, to bury the truth, to poison those who might expose it, to do whatever was necessary to maintain the fiction that racial categories were natural and that slavery was justified. That's the real horror of this story. Not the poisoning, not the deception, not even the enslavement of a son by his own father. The horror is in the casual way it was all done, the efficiency with which a human life was erased from the official record, the certainty that reputation mattered more than humanity. The Chapman family thought they had succeeded. For more than a century, they did succeed. The secret stayed buried. The reputation remained intact, and Lucas Chapman's true identity remained unknown to almost everyone, including himself for most of his life. But secrets have a way of surviving. Truth has a way of emerging, even from the deepest graves. The falsified documents were discovered. The pattern of poisoning was recognized. The baptismal record was found. Lucas's letter was preserved and eventually made public. And now we know. Now the story has been told. And Richard Chapman, who worked so hard to hide his son, who falsified documents and silenced witnesses and allowed his wife to poison the enslaved to maintain his secret, he failed. His shame is now public. His crime is now recorded. And his son, who he tried to erase from history, has become more memorable than he ever was. If this story disturbed you the way it disturbed me, consider subscribing. Because the history we uncover here isn't comfortable, but it's true. And truth, no matter how terrible, matters more than comfortable lies. The cotton fields of Sweetwater Plantation are silent now. The main house stands empty except for tourists who walk through its carefully restored rooms, taking photos and marveling at the antebellum architecture. The slave quarters have been preserved as monuments to suffering, their rough planks and dirt floors carefully maintained as reminders of how people lived and worked and died in bondage. But if you stand there at dusk, when the tour groups have left and the shadows grow long across the old cotton fields, you might think about all the stories those walls could tell, all the secrets they witnessed, all the lives they contained, all the truths that were buried in those fields along with the people who knew them. And you might wonder, as I do, what other impossible stories are still waiting to be discovered. What other children were hidden, what other truths were buried, what other evidence of our collective shame lies mouldering in forgotten archives, waiting for someone to notice that the numbers don't quite add up, that the documents don't quite match, that the official story doesn't quite explain the reality. Lucas Chapman's story is extraordinary because we know it, but it's probably not unique. Somewhere in the vast documentary record of American slavery, there are other discrepancies, other inconsistencies, other secrets that might finally come to light if someone looks carefully enough, asks the right questions, and refuses to accept convenient lies. The work of uncovering those stories continues, and every time one emerges from the darkness, we understand a little more about what slavery really was. Not the sanitized version taught in textbooks, but the lived reality of a system that treated human beings as property and bent every institution, every law, every social norm to maintain that fundamental injustice. Lucas Chapman lived free for 43 years after leaving South Carolina. That's not long enough to make up for 22 years in bondage, but it's something. He built a life, raised a family, contributed to his community, and found dignity in freedom that he had been denied in slavery. And at the end, he made sure the truth survived. He wrote it down, sealed it carefully, and trusted his descendants to preserve it until a time when it could be told without danger. That act of remembrance, that refusal to let his story die with him, is perhaps his greatest legacy. Because now we remember, now we know, and knowing we cannot forget. That's what makes these stories matter. Not the facts themselves, the dates, the names, the documents, but what they force us to confront about our past and about the systems of oppression that we built and maintained and benefited from. Every time we uncover a story like Lucas Chapman's, we're pulling back the veil on a history that was carefully constructed to hide the worst of what happened. We're forcing ourselves to see what generations of Americans tried to forget or ignore or explain away. And maybe, if we look long enough and unflinchingly enough at these terrible truths, we'll finally understand that the past isn't really past. That the systems that enslaved Lucas Chapman, the racial categories, the power hierarchies, the casual dehumanization, didn't disappear when slavery ended. They evolved, adapted, found new forms, but never fully went away. Lucas Chapman's story is a window into that history. And through that window, if we're brave enough to look, we can see not just the past, but also the present. Not just what was, but what continues to be. That's why these stories matter. That's why they have to be told. That's why we can't let them stay buried. The earth remembers. The documents remember. And now, because someone noticed a discrepancy in old plantation records and had the courage to investigate, we remember too.